So in this book, basically, Alex wants to argue that we should scrap elections, that we should get rid of politicians, that we should eliminate political parties, and essentially that we should just replace democracy as we know it with a system in which randomly selected citizens are given power to make law and to govern us, even though nobody elected them. And that might sound like a wild idea, but Alex's book, I think, actually provides a very careful, thorough, and extremely persuasive case for autocracy. So I figure we should just kick things off by Alex. I want to invite you if you could just tell us in broad strokes, for those who don't already know, what autocracy is, and I guess how it differs from democracy as we know it.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks everyone for being here. Right, so the book has two parts. The first part raises a bunch of worries about electoral democracy, and the second part is really an attempt to imagine a very different form of government that would, I think, also count as a democracy. So I argue for that toward the end of the book, but it would work very differently. So rather than having elections at the heart, it would have random selection or sortition, as it's been called, where people would be randomly selected to serve on single issue legislative bodies. So as I envision autocracy in the book, there'd be sort of a network of maybe 20 different single issue legislative bodies focusing each on a distinct political topic, so education or agriculture or health. And the randomly chosen citizens would be able to make policy directly. There'd be an extensive process sort of behind that. So people would be randomly chosen, then they'd have a chance to learn about the different issues during a learning phase, hearing from experts and advocates and stakeholders. And then there'd be internal discussion and deliberation. There'd be engagement with the community, trying to learn about broader views about these issues and what people thought about them. And then eventually the randomly chosen citizens serving on these legislatures could directly enact policy. So lots and lots of issues to talk about in terms of the details of all the parts of that. But the overall aim would be to have a system that could work entirely without elections. And so in the book, I focus on the legislative branch. I also mentioned that the executive power would be no longer fulfilled by an elected executive, but would also be executive assemblies. But I don't get into those details as much in the book. Next book maybe, but or maybe somebody else can write that book. But so that's the basics of the system.
So has anything like this system ever been tried before or implemented elsewhere?
Well, the thing many people point to is sort of ancient Athens. Several of the main political institutions were selected, citizens selected at random. And so that's often seen. So you can see Aristotle saying things like, if you want democracy, use lottery selection. If you want oligarchy, use elections. And so, ancient democracy, birthplace of democracy, but that's a very different context. And so then there's various appearances of using random selection in politics throughout history. There's some really nice historical work on, in medieval Italy and other places around the world. But recently, there's been a lot of innovation around what are called citizens' assemblies or citizen juries, where randomly chosen citizens are brought together to work on a particular political issue, political problem. So far, nothing like the system that I envision in terms of the scope or the scale. But there's a lot of this kind of experimentation happening around the world, particularly in Europe, actually, but all throughout the world, using randomly chosen citizens in different ways in political systems.
I'm sort of curious to know why you think, so it sounds like various, I guess, less extreme forms of autocracy on smaller scales are on the rise across various parts of the world. Do you have any theories about why that might be? It seems like it's, in some sense, the right time for you to propose autocracy. It's increasingly popular.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting, it's taken me so long to write this book. I started working on it in some sense in 2007, having just learned about citizens' assemblies, in particular, the British Columbia Citizens Assembly, where in the province in Canada, there were sort of randomly chosen citizens used to kind of rethink the voting system and the basics of the system there. Um, So that's how I first encountered it. But I think there's, in that instance, it was a clear case where they didn't want to let the elected legislative officials make decisions about these issues because they were creating rules and drawing districting and thinking about voting rules that would favor the incumbents. And so it was a case where getting input from outside that process seemed really important. I think there's a lot of frustration around the world with how electoral democracy is performing. And so I think that's made it so that many people are open to maybe thinking about alternatives or how might we alter things. So rather than just thinking about picking a new person in this office, maybe there's something more systemic. And I think that's where maybe there's thirst and interest in opening up our political imagination a little bit. And I really, part of the hope for the book is that even if you don't like Latocracy in particular, that people start seeing this as a bigger task that we all should be taking up in terms of, reimagining, rethinking how our political institutions are working at something of a systemic foundational level.
So I'm definitely interested in getting more into the details of hearing about, Latocracy and how it works. But just before we do that, because you mentioned one explanation for why people are perhaps experimenting with this kind of random selection in various forms in various countries, you said that it seems like people are increasingly kind of frustrated with democracy. And your book, I think, is basically structured in this way. What motivates Latocracy is, as you say in the first half of the book, these kinds of various problems that electoral democracy has. So I was hoping that we could first talk about what some of those problems are, because then we could sort of see, I guess, how Latocracy as a proposed solution might overcome some of the things that are causing people to be frustrated with democracy. And I guess I myself am always sort of surprised when I hear that people are frustrated with democracy, because also around the world, it's sort of frequently held up as this, gold standard of governance. It seems like democracies tend to be more prosperous, peaceful. They typically grant more freedoms to their citizens. But yeah, as you say, it seems like democracy isn't all that great. So I guess two questions just on the side of being down on democracy. What really is wrong with democracy? Why are people frustrated with it, do you think? And do you think it's doing especially poor lately? Or is this just sort of like a problem with democracy as such?
Yeah, I mean, so for me, it's really important. I would not describe myself as down on democracy, but down on electoral representative democracy or something like that. And even that has to be really qualified. So I really do agree with Churchill and this idea that maybe it's the worst form of all the systems that we've, but it still could be the best, right? Of all the ones that we've, sorry, it's I'm messing the quote up. It's the worst system except for all the other ones that we've tried, right? So it's a huge advance, a huge improvement over authoritarian political systems, dictatorships, various forms of authoritarian monarchs, right? So there's a lot of alternatives that are worse. And in a way, I think what we're seeing is just that it's not perfect, right? And there might be conditions under which it really runs into trouble. And I think for me, the big ones that I stress in the book are kind of the size and scale of political life in the modern world, where the big issue is, we're supposed to be using representatives, and we're using representatives because there's too much for all of us to learn, to get into all the details. Otherwise, why not just have a direct democracy where we all vote on everything all the time? It's thought that's going to be unwieldy and we'd get really bad results because most of us don't have time to learn about all the different issues. So instead, we'll pick these individuals, these representatives who will act on our behalf. And the core there, the mechanism that's supposed to make that work is elections, right? Where we will then be able to kick them out of office if they're not doing things that work well for all of us. But the difficulty is that we need to know a lot to be able to hold them meaningfully accountable. So we have the ability to kick people out of office, but that only is useful if we're doing well at selecting people who are going to do, act on our behalf and can monitor them in a detailed way to assess whether they actually are acting on our behalf or not. So in the book, I raise a bunch of worries that, in fact, we're not going to be able to do that anymore, partly the problems are so complex and the scale is so vast, it's hard for us to make assessments in a knowledgeable, detailed way about what people have actually done in office and whether it's actually in our interests. So that's a big kind of worry. And the fear is that in the background, if we aren't, as the voters, able to hold them meaningfully accountable, they can do whatever they want and then tell us, oh, this is going to be good for you, or this is clearly in your interests, and we won't be able to tell the difference. And they'll have incentives to do what's in the interests of the most powerful, who can effectively capture them sort of behind the scenes and lobby effectively for the results that, the elite, the powerful, the multinational corporation that is being represented actually wants. And so as a result, we get a political system that isn't really doing well at addressing most people's problems, most of the urgent issues that we face, whether economic or environmental. And I think people have a sense that it isn't working in these ways. Now, as for whether it's new, like in some ways it's not, right? So I think some of these problems have been present from the beginning, especially outside of small kind of scale, political communities. Some of those issues have been present, but they've become intensified in at least two ways. One is increasing globalization means a lot of the effects of policy are no longer limited to the domestic sphere, and a lot of the influences that affect our well-being are no longer limited to the domestic sphere. So it's harder and harder for us to become well-informed. I think also a big issue in the background is the way in which, we used to have a kind of common epistemic sort of source where most citizens in a country would be informed by one of several major news corporations, the three major news networks in the United States, for example, which covered the news in a very similar way. In the 80s and 90s, you get a lot of market segmentation with cable and cable news. And then in the 2000s and beyond, with the internet and social media and algorithmic echo chambers, I think we end up getting a highly fragmented epistemic background. And so as a result, most of us aren't embracing the same reality. We don't think of the problems in the same way, and it becomes much easier to sow discord and much easier to distract us and lead us through misinformation to all kinds of false views about problems and solutions. And all of that makes electoral democracy work much less well. And so some of that story is a kind of epistemic story with modern technology. Some of it's just a story of size and scale, but I think those have really combined to make it very hard for electoral democratic systems to function effectively.
So you mentioned some epistemic concerns in particular about citizens' abilities to, I guess, hold their representatives meaningfully accountable, and it sounds like they just don't have the information needed to do that. So this is going to shift things a little bit more now to some of the details of autocracy. I'm sure a lot of people are curious if we're so bad as citizens at just telling whether or not our representatives are doing what they're supposed to be doing. How can we sort of expect ordinary citizens to be the lawmakers? That almost seems like a much higher epistemic burden on them. It seems like they'd have to know a lot more to create law.
Yeah, so this is one of the reasons, I mean, a big innovation, a big change is using lotteries rather than elections. Another big change is single issue legislative bodies rather than a generalist legislature. I talk a lot about that change in the book. There's a whole chapter on this idea of using single issue legislatures. One main reason for it is it really reduces the epistemic burden on individual citizens. It makes it considerably more manageable to imagine somebody, in the book, I suggest people might serve 3-year terms. Within, some relatively manageable period of time, you might learn enough about, say, agriculture or health or education, or at least some of the big issues of the day that are being discussed in terms of policy, so that you could have a somewhat informed opinion. So part of that is through, you've been randomly selected onto this body. I would have 450 people serving on each one of these, with 150 people coming newly each year, serving 3-year terms. So there'd be some stagger there. And the hope is that learning from experts and advocates and stakeholders about the issues, about the kind of nuances of particular policy ideas, having extended period of time to deliberate and discuss the details of those policy issues, all of that kind of concentrated attention would make it so that even people with no background knowledge on the topic could learn enough to have a somewhat informed opinion. And so part of it is just thinking this will be comparatively better than what we get through elections, where we have no detailed knowledge of policy, and a lot of our discussions about elections focus almost entirely on the personalities of these candidates and much less on details of political issues. And so for a lot of reasons, I think, this would make it somewhat more manageable for people to learn about these issues, have an informed view. So I also think that, the problem with elections isn't that we're not capable. It isn't that we aren't competent in some general sense to learn enough about politics to make good decisions. The limitations are both from our time and just not having the ability to focus our attention on this one task, but also on all the background misinformation. And one of the things that the randomly chosen citizens working in the autocracy would be able to do is get a somewhat higher quality higher access to higher quality information about these issues. Not that it'd be completely untainted by bias and interest and all those kinds of things, but there'd be at least more time to sift through it and screen it and think about whether you're getting a kind of representative picture.
So I just want to pick up on something you mentioned at the end then, because we're sort of talking about this learning phase, I guess, for citizens, where once they join one of these single issue legislative bodies, they have to sort of learn a lot very quickly in order to be able to make competent decisions. So it seems like there's still going to be a role for them, or sorry, there's still going to be a role for, I guess, people who are supposed to be experts who help skill them up, right? Who help train them to learn enough about the issues. And you mentioned the worry of bias at the end, and I imagine it's one that many people will have, because it seems like we can randomly select citizens, but we can't randomly select sort of people to be experts because that's already a sort of well-defined group. We have to look at training, expertise, credentials, things like that. So are you worried about the fact that once you've got sort of 450 people in a room, it almost becomes more easy to bias or manipulate citizens, especially citizens who now have a lot of decision-making power? Or are there mechanisms in your sort of autocracy system for trying to select experts that are supposed to be more, I don't know, neutral, independent, nonpartisan?
Yeah, so great question. So I talk a lot about experts because I think it's one of the places where in the modern political world, almost all policy requires a ton of expertise in the background, right? For people to try to sift through different policy ideas and think about would they actually respond well to these problems. And there's a question of how expertise is going to come into any political system, whether autocracy or electoral democracy or something else. And I think there's a bunch of different ways in which it comes in. The vision for autocracy is really having kind of a learning phase and deliberation and community consultation as like different mechanisms by which people learn about the issue and learn about how it might be affecting the political community. With respect to experts in particular, I think there's a general problem of how do we as non-experts decide to rely on experts. So that's an old philosophical problem. It goes back to Plato, or if not before, and a hard issue, right? No easy solutions there, but there's a lot of things that we can try to do in terms of, as you mentioned, having credentials and ways of evaluating people who proclaim to be experts with respect to some domain. Different kinds of metrics will be important for different domains. So how we judge an expert chemist is going to be different than how we judge an expert mechanic, but we can still come up with different indications of expertise. So in the book, I talk through the possibility of doing this in a kind of structured way where purported experts for different domains could have all of their epistemic credentials identified and listed and recorded in a database. And then once we had that database, once that was in place, we could then randomly select people from that database to serve as an expert with respect to some specific domain that was relevant to the policy issue. And so in the book, that's the institutional design model that I try to detail and develop, like how might that work? How could we create this database? How would it work to police it? One of the big mechanisms in the background is what I talk about in the book under the heading of structural assemblies. So there'd be a number of assemblies that weren't focused just on, or weren't focused at all on making law or policy, but were instead needed in the background to kind of help make sure the system was working well. So these would also be made up of randomly chosen citizens, but they would be focused on questions like, how do we create and maintain this database of experts? How do we properly get people to list their various financial conflicts of interest and other kinds of biases? And so those kinds of things would need to be policed in the background. The hope wouldn't be to create a sort of, here is the view about what we should do policy wise. It'd be much more, here's a number of different ideas from different experts, and in some cases also advocates and stakeholders about what we ought to do in this domain. In each case, people would be, disclosing what their background was, what their training was, who was funding them, if anyone, in the same way that we do in the political arena now or in the legal arena. People would have to be, forthcoming about those things, but it allow ordinary citizens to kind of hear these different perspectives and think about those issues and put them in, perspective. It also would avoid the worries about cherry picking experts just because they're going to say a thing that's of interest to a particular side. So in the US, in the legal context, when you have experts testifying for a plaintiff or a defendant, they're often handpicked because they'll say something that's going to be helpful to that side's case. I think you really don't want that in the political context. We don't want to find the one or two scientists out there who are legitimate scientists who actually are skeptical of this or that and have them testify as if that's the scientific view. Instead, they'd be sort of proportionally represented because of the random selection. And so very occasionally such a person might speak, but most of the time you'd get a kind of, what is the going view here? And in a place where there's a lot of conflict, that would be represented too.
I mean, one of the things I think this comes out of your answer right now, but that your book does extremely well is it really thinks through a lot of the various options and mechanisms and possibilities for these concerns about bias, capture, and the various ways in which people who are sitting on these single issue legislative bodies might no longer sort of, I guess, represent the interests of the more general population. So I want to just kind of pick up on that because I think your book also has a really interesting discussion about the ways in which these sort of ordinary citizens who become our representatives are not representatives in the way that we have representatives in a kind of electoral democracy. So what happens in the system basically is, you have the general public who's largely excluded, I guess, through a lottery from political decision making, though their turn might come up eventually. But I wonder about this idea that you might frequently see situations where the decision made by some legislative body is actually one that's opposed by the broader public. In which case it seems like the members who are selected to be on these deliberative legislative bodies don't really mirror or represent the preferences or values of the public. And it almost seems like we should expect this by design, because if their judgments match the public, we wouldn't really need them, I guess. So I suppose my question for you is something like, if we find ourselves regularly in a situation where a very small minority of people, like the 450 on one of these legislative bodies, are imposing a law on the vast majority of citizens, even though the citizens disagree with the law, is there something sort of worrying about that scenario?
Yeah, a couple of things. So one is, I think for a lot of actual political issues, many people have no view or opinion at all, right? They just have never encountered the details of the issue or thought about it, like the specifics of, financial instrument regulation or some sort of agribusiness like tariff or something. It might be that people have a robust view about a few issues, but I think many of us just don't know anything about quite a lot of the actual decisions that are being made. So it's not as if there's some broad public opinion that's all in one place on the thing. I just think we don't have a formed will or opinion at all on a lot of these topics, especially with the electoral context where we're sort of encouraged to concentrate our attention over here on the issues that most divide us, you know, as a result of the elected officials' incentives or the candidates' incentives to get us to turn out and vote for them, then there's a whole bunch of stuff that just doesn't get any political discussion or coverage, where there are decisions being made, but I think they're made in the shadows, right? And I think that's where you get a lot of special interest capture, where we haven't, as the public, had much conversation at all about them. So in many of these cases, I think what we need actually is a way of generating something like a democratic opinion that's really representative of the people on these topics. And that's where I see the randomly chosen citizens really offering that. So these are people just like us from all different occupations, all different backgrounds, all different life experiences, all different values, all different political views being brought together to think about some issue. And I think for many of us who haven't thought about that issue, we might not know what we would think, but then we can see them, observe what they have gone through, and hear from them. You know, there's a lot of places for community engagement and community consultation. So it's not as if it's a black box and they announce their judgment to the world and then we just have to live with it. We can hear from them. You know, they can write op-eds and describe, why are we opting for this policy in this area? Like, why is this our answer on this question? And in that way, I think build a broader sense, a broader kind of public view on that topic. But partly with the broader public who didn't take part in this process, deferring somewhat reasonably to these people who are in other ways just like them, but who have gone through learning, thinking more about this, talking to other people about this issue. So I think that's a place where a lot of us, I think, would be somewhat willing to defer to a process like this that seemed to be designed so as to kind of excavate or elicit opinion on these topics that might otherwise, you know, most of us wouldn't have a very clear view. Now, there might be some topics where maybe there's a broad view out there, maybe it's a 50-50 split in the community about that topic, and the randomly chosen citizens come out one way, and then, you know, that might depart from what half of the broader community wants. That's a very familiar result, right? From elections, we learn to live with that kind of disagreement. We don't always get our way. I think the reason we accept that is not just because, you know, we all had a vote or something like that. I mean, that might be part of the story, but part of it too is we can see we need a fair process for making decisions under conditions of disagreement. And I think, you know, this process, like other processes, might well seem reasonable and fair in that regard. I should add too, there's lots of additional mechanisms we can add in if we were worried about this, where, you know, maybe the randomly chosen citizens come up with one proposal, they enact it, and we can have a recall mechanism where if 2/3 of the broader public then voted against it in a kind of recall referendum, then it would no longer be law. So you could add in some of that direct democratic participation if one wanted. I think there are worries about that because I think a lot of that is going to be more susceptible to manipulation and capture by elites who try to inform the broader public very briefly about this issue, but not in a detailed way. And so I worry about those kinds of mechanisms. But if someone were more worried or if it proved to be a problem, that's the kind of thing that we could certainly consider introducing.
So that proposal at the end, yeah, I find it fascinating because there's this idea that if, you know, a large enough portion of the population disagrees with the outcome of a decision by one of these single issue legislators, then maybe that's reason for recall. And in some sense, that looks like it kind of gets accountability to the populace back in the picture in a way that I feel like some people might worry about a lack of accountability when it comes to just these sort of randomly selected bodies of small groups of citizens. So there's a few things that you say in the book which at least made my ears perk up because they might worry people. So sentences like, you know, that the randomly selected citizens didn't promise anything to anyone, or they're not chosen to represent a particular group or place. No one authorized these people to be their agents, and so they're not specifically accountable to anyone. Those all, in some sense, to people who are really familiar with electoral democracy, those statements sound very worrying to me. But it also sounds like you are somewhat hesitant about the idea of having this accountability mechanism about, if the majority of people don't like the outcome, then it looks like we're just doing electoral democracy. We can recall the decisions made. So I'm curious to hear more about why it is that we shouldn't be so worried about concerns of accountability when it comes to when it comes to autocracy, basically.
Yeah, great. I mean, one of the hard things is I think the idea of accountability is kind of a messy, muddy one. So in a lot of contexts, we set up what economists call principal agent relationships, where, we are the principal and we pick somebody to be our agent, and they're going to then act on our behalf. And there's a big puzzle about how we're going to make sure that they actually do act on our behalf. So hire a mechanic. What guarantee do you have that they're going to really fix your car and do so in a kind of economically responsible, affordable way? You don't know enough about, cars and auto mechanic, whatever, to actually assess this directly. So we need other mechanisms, right? And there might be business reputation scores or reviews online or this kind of thing that we use to try to, you know, figure this out. With elected officials, the mechanism is supposed to be the election, right? We can hold them accountable. We put this person in power, we give them all this power, and there's a question, why will they act on our behalf? And it's supposed to be that we can kick them out. But what I argue in the book is that under the autocratic system, these randomly chosen people, they're not supposed to be serving as my particular representative in that way. It's not a principal agent relationship at all, as I argue in the book. They are supposed to be acting on the behalf of everybody or on the behalf of the people that they care about. The way in which the system is going to work well, though, is not because they're going to be specifically accountable via some mechanism where I can punish or discipline or sanction them. And so the question is, well, what is that mechanism? And there's a couple different answers there. One is just that I think most of us are fairly well-intentioned, absent the potential distorting effects of various kinds. So if somebody's going to be bought off and paid by some industry to vote a certain way, that's going to distort what they do. So you need mechanisms to make sure that people wouldn't be taking money and wouldn't be bought off in those ways. I talk about a bunch of those in the book. One big one is just we could pay them quite well for their service and make it illegal to take money from other places and make them even get a reward if they report somebody trying to buy them off in these ways, and create those kinds of incentives so they'll act, just based on their own thinking about it. And then there's a kind of moral accountability. So if you're all of a sudden you're, driving along and you see some person stranded by the side of the road and they've been in a terrible accident and you're the first car along, you might stop and think, oh, I have an obligation to try to help this person. And you might call somebody or drive to the nearest town, and you're sort of representing the person's interests. You're trying to help them. You're acting on their behalf, but they didn't pick you. You just happened to be the person who came along, and you owe it to them as a morally good person to kind of do what you can to help them, right? And obviously this can go wrong in various ways, but that's the kind of idea that I think is going on here, where this would be a way of serving everybody. And in these roles, you'd come to be accountable. You'd return to your community. If you made some terrible decisions, those would have effects on everybody, including the people you care about. So those would provide incentives to care and do a good job and do your best. Would it be perfect? No, but I think it'd be better than what we get through the kind of distortion and elite capture that we actually see now, where the electoral accountability mechanism just doesn't work well to actually prevent them from just acting on behalf of special elite interests rather than acting on all of our behalf. So that's the hope anyway, that it's a very different kind of accountability. Why is it that the person who stops to help the motorist is going to do a good job? It's like, well, I mean, why do any of us treat anyone well? So that's where there's a kind of optimism in the background, and there's a naivete that we might be worried about, that like, well, isn't surely there going to be all kinds of distortion and capture and people, and yeah, that's the kind of thing we'd need to police. One of the things I found encouraging is looking at these citizens assemblies and the way they've worked around the world, And the people who go through these experiences, it's remarkable. I mean, it's often for many of them life-changing. They feel hopeful and optimistic about politics again, even in arguing with people about issues like abortion and same-sex marriage, highly controversial. It's like the conditions of in-person discussion, there's respect, there's genuine understanding, even through disagreement. All of those things I think we're capable of. And in a way, our political system is sort of not bringing out the best in us. So the hope is with a different kind of system, you would see less of some of the worst behavior that I think we see now in political life.
This idea that you mentioned of, will it be perfect? No, but will it be better? Probably yes. I thought one of the, I guess, most reassuring and common themes throughout your book, because as one reads through these sort of radical proposals, you often think like, oh, but isn't there this worry about, capture? Isn't there this worry about bias coming in it somewhere? And I think during the last presidential election, Joe Biden said something like, don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternatives. And, going back to your Churchill reference, it sort of sounds like you shouldn't be asking whether or not autocracy can do it all and eliminate all problems, but will it do significantly better than democracy? So I think your book does a great case, does a great job making that case. One thing I'd like to hear a bit more about, though, is are there some, I guess, places, societies where you think plutocracy would work especially well? And the reason I ask this is because at one point in the book, you mentioned that there's no ideal political system in general. Rather, there's just systems that are good or better for some particular societies. So you're not treating plutocracy as this like holy grail that all societies should implement immediately. But I was curious to know more about the conditions under which you think it would succeed, or perhaps maybe more interestingly, those societies in which we could expect it to fail.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think sometimes somewhat flippantly, I'll say, if there's a political community where people would not trust the government to run a fair lottery, where you buy a lottery ticket and you could win $1 million because of so much background corruption and that kind of thing. I think that'd be a very hard system to really trust the autocratic mechanism, that the selection would be really random, that the people in these different roles would genuinely, be there because of the random selection. So that's a kind of first, we would need some basic commitment to fair procedures, transparency, and those kinds of mechanisms of accountability, a functioning legal system where if somebody were shown to be taking a lot of money on the side, that would actually get a legal response. So I think there's a lot of background legal and political infrastructure and norms that would need to be present before you could roll this out, certainly at scale, right? So I think a lot of small communities could operate quite easily using something like plutocracy. If you have personal knowledge of the other people in your town or village, and, I think there we could pretty easily work a plutocracy. But as soon as you get to the size and scale of 5 million or 50 million people, and you don't have that personal knowledge or reputation, then you start to worry about those kinds of things. I think another big factor is education. Is there a basic commitment to public education of the whole community so that any randomly chosen person might be in a decent place, at least to participate and contribute? And I think one of the things I like about plutocracy and sortition in general is the way it kind of foregrounds, are we really committed to government by all of us, right? Are we really committed to equality in that sense and the idea that any of us really could govern? So CLR James has this great early paper, Any Cook Can Govern, really taking seriously that like a real commitment to equality shouldn't be, oh yeah, I'm happy to live in a democracy where we can choose people who went to Harvard or Yale or Princeton or Stanford, right? That's our election. And it's like, no, no, that's not democracy. That's some other thing. So yeah, those are, I think, some of the background conditions, kind of commitment to public education, legal norms and legal procedures around corruption. Um, and then beyond that, I think actually in a lot of places where there's been some frustration with how elections are functioning, that might be an easy entry point. So thinking about states in the United States rather than at the federal level, a lot of room for state experimentation at the city level, the county level, the municipal level, might be opportunities for using some autocratic elements. Many people like the idea of one of two chambers being randomly selected and the other elected. So you start to get people familiar with randomly selected people having a role in politics. So yeah, I think there's ways of trying it out somewhat gradually that would be really important so we could see what works and what doesn't.
So I know we're sort of coming up to time, and I want to make sure we have, leave time for questions from the folks who've attended. But yeah, I'll just wrap up with one final question, just picking up what you sort of just said, if there's time. But if not, then happy to. Urja, is there time for one final question or no?
I think,
We can go straight to discussion if you want.
yeah, that's
Yeah,
okay. We've
cool.
got a few questions coming in. Again, I think it's your fault for having such an interesting conversation. That makes quite a bit of audience engagement. So we've had a few questions on the role of political parties. So Peter asks, what will be the role, if any, of political parties under a autocracy? And Julian asks, are there not some important contributions that political parties try to make in a political system? And they give some examples where, for the sake of consensus building, for kind of having consistency among policies and other things of that nature.
Yeah, great. I mean, I think that's one of the really interesting questions. So, the founders of the US government had no inkling of the role that political parties would play in electoral politics. So, the US, they thought, well, the person who gets the most votes should be the president. The person who gets the second most votes should be the vice president, right? This is like now mind-boggling. It seems like, no, these are going to be people who are politically aligned in various ways. And so I think it's hard to know what role political parties would have under autocracy. I think one of the things the single issue structure has as an advantage is that can disaggregate things that don't really belong together from a philosophical, theoretical, ideological vantage point. Like there's no reason that, relatively regressive tax rates should go along with pro-life anti-abortion agenda or something. These are, they happen to go together in some places, but they're not deeply connected. And there's, I think, real trouble with connecting stuff in those ways. There's other places where parties and ideology more generally might help supply a coherence, right? You've got a vision of what the political system should be doing. And I think in a lot of countries that have proportional representation systems where you get more different political parties, they do better at actually having something like a coherent vision behind what they're up to. There's issues with those kinds of systems, but I think what we see in the US in places with two dominant political parties is much less coherence. And the other way in which coherence gets undermined is every 2 or 4 years, the country decides to go this way or that way or this way. And over time, you don't get a very coherent idea. The single issue legislatures in the autocracy would introduce some potential for conflict, and that might be a place where in the background, you could imagine a political party, trying to form around, let's think about these several issues in a similar way. And then there's a lot of places where ordinary citizens, not randomly chosen to serve, could have influence. So in the learning phase, advocates and stakeholders would have a chance to speak. Advocates would usually be people that had enough background support, maybe through organized political activity in the form of a political party, to have enough signature so they could actually have a voice in the learning phase representing a perspective on the topic. During the community consultation phase, similarly, there might be room for organized political parties, maybe around particular issues rather than a broad platform. But that might be a place where they too could exert some influence. So hard to say exactly what role, but I'm sure they would appear in some form. Yeah.
Oh, you're muted, Urja.
Whoops. I was just going to say, Michael, if you wanted to jump in, but if not, I can move on to the next question.
Happy to move on.
Okay. This is quite a specific but interesting question from Tom, who asks, would an expert in the relevant field who was randomly chosen for the legislative body be recused from membership? So again, if randomly some expert got chosen, and if not, wouldn't that person have disproportionate influence?
Yeah, so I wouldn't think that we would, I certainly not on my preferred version of it. I don't suggest that people should be recused. I actually argue for a somewhat more capacious understanding of expertise on which we're all experts with respect to some domains, right? So it might be something as, how do you heat up a frozen pizza or something like this, might be relatively fine-grained. But there'd be lots of things where I think we don't want to just look at expertise as like, oh, you got a PhD in some subject. Many people that have expertise from their occupation, having worked in some career for some period of time, maybe from their personal experience, living as a disabled person with this particular condition. You would have a lot of, what I think should count as expertise. And the hope actually is when you bring all of these different people together, having this genuine microcosm representation, you'd get much better informed decisions as a result. So it's a way of not in advance specifying what knowledge or expertise will be required to think about the problem. Now, it's true if somebody came in as, let's say it's I don't know, an education single issue legislative body, and one of the people is like superintendent of the school district or something like that, or has a PhD in education. It might be some appropriate role for deference to that person on some topics. But also, I think everyone would acknowledge there's limits to that. So they might have their own particular view. They might be able to speak a little bit about their experience, but it's not that everyone should just sort of defer to that person. One of the chapters talks at length about deliberation, and we've all been in groups where a person dominates the conversation and not everyone gets a word in, and often there's sociological and demographic skew and who has that kind of role. That's a place where I think structuring the deliberation in various ways would be important so that everyone had a chance to speak, people were respectful and actually listening to each other. And so the hope would be even an expert, on some topic, they'd have influence, but it wouldn't come to be disproportionate or in troubling ways distortion. Yeah.
Interesting. Carl asks if comparing plutocracy to the current jury system in the US would be an apt comparison.
Yeah, I mean, there's a way in which that's kind of the most familiar way that randomly chosen citizens are showing up somewhere in the legal or political world. A couple of really big differences. So one is that juries are very small, so they are, somewhere between 10 and 12 people in most jurisdictions. They have to make a lot of their decisions as a group in a unanimous way. And also they're super focused on one or two very particular questions. And in the US anyway, those are factual questions about exactly what happened based on a very limited body of evidence that's been presented to them through like a very formal procedure. And so they're bringing much less of themselves to the task. So they're not supposed to kind of introduce lots of evidence from their own personal experience. They do sometimes, but that's not the point. And they're really not supposed to be sifting through big value questions about what's important and all of those things. They, in fact, often will get in trouble or overturned if it turns out that, yeah, they were trying to undercut the law in general rather than focus on this particular question. So that's one big set of differences. Another is that the incentives and the support for people serving in juries here is quite limited. And so I think as a result, you see a lot of people trying to get out of jury service. And so there's some, I think, troubling skew. It's also true that lawyers are allowed to strike some people from the jury pool because they think that person might have specific detailed knowledge of what it's like to go through that. So I talk about that at length in the book as a kind of problem that we shouldn't be ruling people out for those kinds of reasons. But in the US jury system, that's a common kind of thing. And so anyway, these are places of dissimilarity. But yeah, I think there's some broad similarity that's important, which is the idea that any of us is sort of fit to play an important role in political life. And I think seeing the jury as an important part of a democratic system to push back against the potential tyranny of the state, in that way, I'm very happy to sort of see it as a kind of continuation and expansion of that basic commitment to each of us being able to really contribute.
Tom asks kind of a related question. He asks if selection in the lottery would be mandatory. Some people might have greater opportunity costs than others in participating. And would we be coercing people to serve?
Yeah, so that's an important choice point. So in the book, I argue for trying to create as many protections and incentives as possible so that it would be easy and great for people to serve, that's something they would welcome, but not to make it mandatory. Partly thinking that it's very hard to make people participate in a good way if you're making them participate as a mandatory thing. So you want them to show up and pay attention and actually engage and think through the issue seriously. It's also a significant life commitment. And I think the main thing I'd want to make sure is that there weren't structural or systemic skew in who doesn't participate. So if it was very hard for single parents to ever participate, or for people whose income was below the poverty level, that would really trouble me. And that's a place where we'd need to think about mechanisms so that that wouldn't be the case. And some of those might be financial, paying people considerably well, maybe even significantly more than they make ordinarily in their working life, but also providing childcare support, offering people the chance to defer service. So if they have young children, or if this is right at the heart of an important part of their career life, and they need, maybe 2 or 3 years or 5 years, they could defer their service. So rather than serving in the midst of this thing, they could wait till it was a little bit calmer. Also, I think things like virtual participation might be possible in a lot of contexts. You wouldn't need to be physically present for 3 years, for instance. As in the book, I mentioned that I think in the Nebraska state legislature, the elected legislature only meets for like 8 to 10 weeks a year or something like that. So these needn't be full-time, every waking moment kinds of responsibilities. So those are definitely things I would think we should pay attention to, but I'm sort of disinclined to go for strictly mandatory service.
And I'll end with one question from Alka. Again, you've got us quite excited about the idea of plutocracy, but Alka asks, most constitutions are structured so that it would be almost impossible to make such a kind of large change of this magnitude in almost any country. And so she's just asking, how do you see this happening? And they ask, for example, in Canada.
Great. So yeah, the last chapter of the book, I try to think about how might we get there from here. So let's say we like the idea. Really hard to imagine exactly how we might get there. Exciting, there's a lot of work around the world being done trying to think about democratic innovation, and a lot of people working on the ground actually doing this. So there's a website, latocracy.org, that I created. And from there, I linked to a bunch of people actually working on the ground, building different institutions using sortition and random selection all around the world. They have lots of wise strategic ideas about how this might be done. I think actual constitutional reform for many is, it's very hard, right? At least in the US at the federal level, nearly impossible. That's not the first place to start for a lot of reasons. One is we don't know enough yet about how they would actually work, but also too hard at the beginning, right? We need to get a broader understanding of these things and more familiarity. I still talk to people who've never heard about any of these ideas. And the hope for me is, write the book, get people to talk about these things, all the work that's already being done by others out there. There's a very nice paper by Arash Abazadeh arguing in Canada in particular that the Canadian Senate is this kind of moribund institution that doesn't do very much. Let's think about changing it to a randomly selected body. There's a group, the Sortition Foundation, that's making a similar argument about the House of Lords in the UK right now, suggesting, what's this body doing? Let's make it a House of Citizens where we randomly choose people. And so one possibility is gradual change, gradual familiarity over time, maybe at a much smaller scale where no big constitutional reform is required initially, or where there might be some openness to that. And I think it's a place where some elected officials might be happy to turn some things over to randomly selected citizens. They don't want to take the heat on those issues. And I see it as a kind of thin end of the wedge strategy where we build familiarity, we build comfort, we build knowledge, and over time, then it becomes hard for the elites who might not want these institutions to push back against them. It'll be too late. Anyway, that's the that's the sort of pie in the sky, most optimistic version of how it might go.